In the summer of 1769, on the rugged island of Corsica, a woman named Letizia Ramolino Bonaparte went into labour during a church service. Legend has it that she barely made it home before giving birth to her second son on a carpet decorated with scenes of ancient heroes. That child, born Napoleon Bonaparte, would grow up to reshape the entire world, conquering nations, crowning himself emperor, and leaving a legacy so profound that we still feel its effects today. But how does a boy from a small Mediterranean island rise to become the master of Europe? How does someone born into relative obscurity command armies, rewrite laws, and terrify kings across the continent? The answer lies not in luck or accident, but in a series of calculated moves, brilliant strategies, and an almost supernatural ability to seize opportunity when it presented itself. By the end of this journey through Napoleon's complete life, you'll understand not just what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it. You'll discover the military genius behind his victories, the political mastermind who revolutionized government, and the complex human being whose ambitions ultimately led to his downfall. We're going to explore every phase of his extraordinary existence, from his humble beginnings as the son of a minor Corsican nobleman to his final exile on a remote Atlantic island. What makes Napoleon's story so compelling isn't just the scale of his achievements, it's the speed with which he rose and fell, the audacity of his dreams, and the way he transformed everything he touched. In less than 2 decades, he went from being an unknown artillery officer to the Emperor of the French, controlling territory from Spain to Poland. His rise was meteoric, his fall equally dramatic, and his impact on history immeasurable. Corsica, in 1769, was barely French territory. The island had been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa just 1 year before Napoleon's birth, and the Corsican people were still fighting for their independence under the leadership of Pasquale Paoli. Napoleon's father, Charles Bonaparte, was a lawyer and minor nobleman who had initially supported Paoli's resistance movement. But when French forces decisively defeated the Corsican rebels at the Battle of Ponte Novo in 1769, Charles made a pragmatic decision that would change his family's destiny forever. He switched sides, pledging loyalty to the French crown. This decision proved crucial for young Napoleon. By aligning with France, Charles gained access to opportunities that would have been impossible under Corsican independence. He secured positions in the French colonial administration and, most importantly, obtained scholarships for his sons to attend French military schools. It was a calculated gamble that paid off spectacularly, though at the cost of being branded a traitor by some of his fellow Corsicans. Napoleon's childhood was shaped by the harsh realities of island life and the complex political situation surrounding his birth. Corsica was a land of vendetta and clan loyalty, where disputes were settled with knives and honour was valued above life itself. The landscape was unforgiving, the climate extreme, and survival required both cunning and strength. These early experiences would forge Napoleon's character in ways that no amount of formal education could match. Letizia Bonaparte, Napoleon's mother, was a formidable woman who managed the household with an iron fist, while her husband pursued his political ambitions. She bore 13 children, though only 8 survived to adulthood, and she instilled in all of them a fierce sense of family loyalty and ambition. Napoleon would later credit his mother with teaching him the value of discipline and the importance of never showing weakness to one's enemies. The Bonaparte family lived in a modest stone house in Ajaccio, the island's capital. While they were considered nobility by Corsican standards, their wealth was limited, and they depended heavily on Charles's connections to the French administration for their status and income. This precarious position taught Napoleon early lessons about the importance of political alliances and the dangers of depending too heavily on the favour of others. When Napoleon was 9 years old, his father's careful cultivation of French connections bore fruit. Through his friendship with the Count of Marbeuf, the French military governor of Corsica, Charles secured a scholarship for Napoleon to attend the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château in northeastern France. It was an opportunity that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, but it came at a personal cost. Napoleon would be separated from his family and his native island, thrust into an alien world where his accent, his background, and his very identity would mark him as an outsider. The journey to France in 1779 was Napoleon's first real venture beyond Corsica's shores. Travelling with his older brother Joseph, who was bound for a different school, Napoleon experienced a mixture of excitement and apprehension as the familiar mountains of his homeland disappeared behind him. He was leaving everything he knew to enter a world that would test every aspect of his character and intelligence. Brienne-le-Château was a prestigious institution designed to prepare the sons of the nobility for careers as officers in the French army. The school was run by the Minims, a Catholic religious order, and life there was strictly regimented. Students rose before dawn for prayers, attended classes throughout the day, and were expected to maintain the highest standards of academic and personal conduct. For a boy accustomed to the relative freedom of Corsican life, it was a jarring transition. Napoleon's early years at Brienne were marked by isolation and mockery from his fellow students. His accent was thick, his French imperfect, and his surname distinctly foreign in its Italian spelling. The other boys, mostly from established French noble families, saw him as a provincial upstart and treated him accordingly. They nicknamed him the Little Corsican and made jokes about his background and appearance. Rather than breaking his spirit, however, this treatment only strengthened Napoleon's resolve and sharpened his competitive instincts. Despite the social challenges, Napoleon excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and history. He devoured books about great military commanders of the past, studying the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Frederick the Great with obsessive intensity. His instructors noted his exceptional memory and his ability to grasp complex strategic concepts that eluded many of his peers. Mathematics came naturally to him, and he showed a particular aptitude for the geometric calculations essential to artillery science. The curriculum at Brienne included not just academic subjects, but also military drill, fencing, and dancing. Napoleon proved adequate at military exercises and surprisingly skilled with a sword, despite his short stature. Dancing, however, remained a source of embarrassment throughout his life. His movements were awkward, his timing poor, and his efforts at courtly grace often produced more laughter than admiration. During his 5 years at Brienne, Napoleon developed the reading habits that would serve him throughout his life. He consumed historical works, military treatises, and philosophical texts with remarkable speed and retention. He kept detailed notes and began developing his own theories about warfare, leadership, and statecraft. His teachers recognized his exceptional intelligence, but also noted certain troubling traits: a tendency toward arrogance, an impatience with authority, and a fierce temper when crossed. The social isolation Napoleon experienced at Brienne had profound psychological effects that would influence his entire career. Cut off from his family and scorned by his peers, he learned to rely entirely on his own abilities and judgment. He developed a deep mistrust of established hierarchies and conventional wisdom, preferring to form his own opinions based on careful study and observation. This intellectual independence would later serve him well as a military commander, but it also contributed to the sense of isolation that would plague him throughout his life. Religious instruction was a significant component of life at Brienne, but Napoleon showed little enthusiasm for spiritual matters. While he went through the motions of Catholic observance, his true devotion was reserved for the classical heroes whose exploits he studied in ancient texts. He was particularly fascinated by the career of Julius Caesar, whose rise from relatively humble origins to absolute power seemed to offer a template for his own ambitions. By 1784, Napoleon's academic performance had earned him admission to the École Militaire in Paris, the most prestigious military academy in France. Only a select few students from Brienne were chosen for this honour, and Napoleon's selection represented both recognition of his abilities and an opportunity to advance far beyond what his birth would normally have allowed. At 15 years old, he was leaving the provincial world of Brienne for the cosmopolitan capital of France, where he would complete his transformation from Corsican provincial to French officer. The École Militaire was a far grander institution than Brienne, housed in magnificent buildings designed by some of France's greatest architects. The curriculum was more advanced, the instructors more distinguished, and the student body drawn from the very highest levels of French society. For Napoleon, it represented both the culmination of his educational journey and the beginning of his real career as a soldier and leader. The transition from provincial Brienne to the grandeur of Paris was overwhelming. The École Militaire stood as a testament to French power and sophistication, its imposing facade designed by Jacques-Ange Gabriel dominating the Champ de Mars. For a teenager who had spent 5 years in relative isolation, the capital's energy was intoxicating. Carriages clattered through cobblestone streets, merchants hawked their wares in bustling markets, and the aristocracy paraded in silks and powders that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. Napoleon threw himself into his studies with characteristic intensity. The curriculum was demanding, covering advanced mathematics, fortification theory, military engineering, and the art of war. Unlike Brienne, where he had been something of an outsider, the École Militaire attracted students based purely on merit and potential. Here, his intellectual gifts were recognized and cultivated by instructors who understood they were training the future commanders of French armies. The academy's library became Napoleon's second home. While other students spent their evenings in social pursuits, he could be found hunched over treatises on siege warfare, studying the campaigns of Turenne and Condé, or working through complex mathematical problems by candlelight. His appetite for knowledge was voracious and systematic. He didn't just read about military history, he analysed it, looking for patterns and principles that could be applied to future conflicts. One instructor who made a lasting impression was Pierre-Simon Laplace, the renowned mathematician and astronomer. Under Laplace's guidance, Napoleon's understanding of ballistics and artillery science reached new heights. The precision required in calculating trajectories and the devastating effectiveness of well-placed cannon fire would later become hallmarks of his military strategy. Laplace would later claim that Napoleon possessed one of the finest mathematical minds he had ever encountered. The social dynamics at the École Militaire were complex and politically charged. France in the 1780s was a nation on the brink of revolutionary change, though few recognized the signs at the time. The monarchy was bankrupt, the nobility resistant to reform, and new ideas about government and society were circulating among intellectuals and progressives. Napoleon absorbed these political currents with the same intensity he brought to his military studies, recognizing that understanding politics was essential for any ambitious officer. Financial pressures constantly threatened Napoleon's position at the academy. His father's death in 1785 left the Bonaparte family in precarious circumstances, and there were moments when it seemed Napoleon might be forced to abandon his studies and return to Corsica. The weight of family responsibility fell heavily on his young shoulders. As the most promising of Charles Bonaparte's sons, Napoleon felt obligated to succeed not just for himself, but for his entire family's future prospects. The contrast between his modest background and the wealth of his fellow students was a source of constant tension. While his classmates received generous allowances from their families and dressed in the finest uniforms money could buy, Napoleon made do with threadbare clothing and carefully rationed meals. This economic disparity reinforced his sense of being an outsider and fueled his determination to prove that merit mattered more than birth or wealth. During his time in Paris, Napoleon also encountered the philosophical works that would shape his worldview. He read Voltaire's critiques of religious authority, Rousseau's theories about the social contract, and Montesquieu's analysis of governmental systems. These Enlightenment thinkers challenged traditional assumptions about monarchy, aristocracy, and divine right, offering alternative models for organizing society based on reason and merit rather than heredity and tradition. The military exercises at the École Militaire were far more sophisticated than anything Napoleon had experienced at Brienne. Mock battles involved hundreds of students maneuvering across the training grounds, testing their ability to coordinate infantry, cavalry, and artillery in complex tactical situations. Napoleon's performances in these exercises were consistently outstanding, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of battlefield dynamics that impressed both instructors and fellow students. His reputation as a strategic thinker grew throughout his time at the academy. Other students began seeking his advice on tactical problems, recognizing that he possessed an unusual ability to see patterns and possibilities that escaped others. Napoleon's confidence in his own judgment increased correspondingly, and he began to develop the supreme self-assurance that would characterize his later career. The graduation examination in 1785 was the culmination of Napoleon's formal military education. Students were tested on every aspect of their training, from theoretical knowledge to practical application. Napoleon's performance was exemplary, earning him a commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery regiment of La Fère. At just 16 years old, he had achieved his goal of becoming an officer in the French army, but this was merely the first step in a journey that would take him far beyond anything he could have imagined. The artillery corps was considered the most technical and intellectually demanding branch of the French military. Unlike the cavalry, which attracted aristocratic glory seekers, or the infantry, which relied primarily on courage and discipline, the artillery required mathematical precision, scientific knowledge, and innovative thinking. It was the perfect assignment for someone of Napoleon's temperament and abilities, offering opportunities to apply theoretical knowledge in practical situations. His first posting took him to the garrison town of Valence in southeastern France, where the regiment of La Fère was stationed. The transition from the stimulating environment of Paris to the provincial routine of garrison duty was jarring. Days were spent in endless drills, equipment maintenance, and administrative duties that seemed to waste his carefully cultivated talents. The boredom was almost unbearable for someone accustomed to constant intellectual stimulation. Yet even in this mundane setting, Napoleon found ways to distinguish himself. He volunteered for additional duties, studied the latest developments in artillery technology, and began writing his own analyses of military problems. His superiors quickly recognized his exceptional abilities and began assigning him responsibilities normally reserved for more senior officers. Within months of his arrival, he was effectively functioning as a staff officer despite his junior rank. The social life of a provincial garrison held little appeal for Napoleon. While his fellow officers spent their evenings gambling, drinking, and pursuing local women, he preferred to read, write, and plan for his future advancement. This antisocial behaviour earned him a reputation as an oddball, but it also allowed him to develop the habits of systematic study and reflection that would serve him throughout his career. Letters from home brought news of continuing financial difficulties and family tensions. His mother, Letizia, was struggling to maintain the family's position in Corsican society, and his younger siblings needed education and support that the family could barely afford. Napoleon felt the weight of these responsibilities keenly, understanding that his success or failure would determine the fate of everyone he cared about. The political situation in France was deteriorating rapidly by the late 1780s. The monarchy's financial crisis had forced King Louis XVI to convene the Estates General for the first time since 1614, bringing together representatives of the clergy, nobility, and commoners to address the nation's problems. What began as an attempt at fiscal reform quickly evolved into a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of French society. Napoleon watched these developments with fascination and growing excitement. The old order that had seemed so permanent and oppressive was beginning to crack, creating opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their background. The revolution that erupted in 1789 would transform not just France, but Napoleon's own prospects in ways he could never have anticipated. The fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, sent shockwaves throughout French society. In garrison towns across the country, officers debated whether to support the revolutionary government or remain loyal to the monarchy. For Napoleon, the choice was never really in doubt. The revolution represented everything he had come to believe about merit, opportunity, and the need to sweep away outdated privileges based on birth rather than ability. The revolutionary wars that engulfed Europe in the 1790s provided Napoleon with the stage he needed to demonstrate his extraordinary talents. As France declared war against the monarchies of Europe, who viewed the revolution as a mortal threat to their own legitimacy, opportunities for rapid advancement multiplied for officers willing to embrace the new order. The old system of promotion, based on noble birth, had crumbled overnight, replaced by a meritocracy that rewarded skill, courage, and results above all else. Napoleon's first real taste of combat came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon, a crucial Mediterranean port that had fallen to British and Royalist forces. The revolutionary government desperately needed to recapture the city, both for strategic reasons and to demonstrate that the Republic could defend itself against foreign intervention. When Napoleon arrived at the siege lines as a captain of artillery, the Republican forces had been stalled for months, unable to break through the formidable defences that protected the harbour. The situation at Toulon was chaotic. Multiple generals had tried and failed to coordinate an effective assault, and morale among the Republican troops was dangerously low. Naval vessels from Britain, Spain, and Naples controlled the harbour, providing the defenders with supplies and reinforcement, while bombarding any Republican positions that came within range. The siege had devolved into a bloody stalemate that was draining resources the revolutionary government could not afford to lose. Napoleon studied the tactical situation with the same analytical approach he had applied to historical campaigns at the École Militaire. While other officers focused on frontal assaults against the strongest enemy positions, he identified a weakness that had escaped everyone else's attention. By positioning artillery batteries on a promontory overlooking the harbour, he could make the anchorage untenable for enemy ships, forcing them to withdraw and leaving the garrison without naval support. His plan was elegant in its simplicity, but required precise execution under extremely dangerous conditions. The guns would have to be moved into position at night, sighted accurately despite enemy fire, and maintained under constant bombardment. When Napoleon presented his strategy to the commanding general, he was initially dismissed as an unknown captain with grandiose ideas. Only the intervention of political commissioners from Paris, who recognized the plan's potential, secured approval for the operation. The battery Napoleon established became known as the Battery of the Convention, and its success exceeded even his optimistic projections. Within days of opening fire, the Allied fleet was forced to evacuate Toulon harbour, taking with them the royalist leaders and many civilian supporters of the monarchy. The garrison, now isolated and facing inevitable assault, surrendered after brief resistance. Napoleon's tactical innovation had broken a siege that had defied solution for months. Recognition came swiftly and dramatically. Promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24, Napoleon found himself elevated far above officers who had served for decades without achieving similar rank. His success at Toulon established his reputation as an artillery expert and innovative tactician, but more importantly, it demonstrated his ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. The political connections he made during the Toulon campaign proved equally valuable. Augustin Robespierre, brother of the powerful revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, was among the political commissioners who had supported Napoleon's plan. Through this relationship, Napoleon gained access to the inner circles of revolutionary politics, where decisions about military appointments and strategic priorities were made. However, political favour in revolutionary France was as dangerous as it was beneficial. When Maximilien Robespierre fell from power and was executed during the Thermidorian reaction in July 1794, anyone associated with the Robespierre faction came under suspicion. Napoleon was arrested and briefly imprisoned on charges of conspiracy. His rapid rise suddenly transformed into a precipitous fall that could have ended with his own appointment with the guillotine. The experience of imprisonment taught Napoleon crucial lessons about the volatile nature of revolutionary politics. Survival required not just military skill, but political acumen and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. When he was released after Robespierre's supporters were purged from government, Napoleon emerged more cautious about political alliances, but also more determined to secure a position that would make him indispensable to any regime. The Directory, the new government that emerged after the fall of Robespierre, faced enormous challenges, both domestic and foreign. The war against the European coalition continued to drain French resources, while internal rebellions threatened to tear the Republic apart. Economic problems plagued the country as inflation destroyed the value of paper currency and food shortages sparked riots in major cities. The government needed military victories to maintain legitimacy, and talented generals who could deliver those victories were in short supply. Napoleon's assignment to the Army of Italy in 1796 came at a moment when his career hung in the balance. At 27, he was the youngest general in French service, commanding troops who were skeptical of his abilities and suspicious of his rapid promotion. The Army of Italy was considered a secondary theatre compared to the main campaigns in Germany and the Low Countries, but for Napoleon, it represented an opportunity to prove himself as an independent commander. The strategic situation in northern Italy was complex and fluid. Austrian and Piedmontese forces controlled much of the region, threatening French positions and blocking access to the wealth of the Italian states. Previous French commanders had achieved limited success but had failed to exploit their victories or coordinate effectively with political objectives. Napoleon inherited an army that was undersupplied, demoralized, and scattered across defensive positions that invited defeat in detail. His first order of business was transforming the army's morale and operational effectiveness. Napoleon understood that soldiers fought best when they believed in their cause and their commander, so he addressed the troops directly, promising them glory, plunder, and victory if they followed his leadership. More importantly, he delivered immediate improvements in their material conditions, ensuring that supplies reached the front lines and that pay arrears were settled as quickly as possible. The Italian campaign that followed showcased every aspect of Napoleon's military genius. His strategy was based on rapid movement, concentrated force, and the principle of defeating enemies separately before they could combine against him. Rather than defending existing positions, he seized the initiative with a series of lightning attacks that kept his opponents off balance and unable to coordinate their responses. The Battle of Montenotte on April 12, 1796, was Napoleon's first major victory as an independent commander. By concentrating his forces against a portion of the Austrian army, while the Piedmontese were too distant to provide support. He achieved local superiority despite being outnumbered overall. The victory opened the road toward Turin and forced the Piedmontese to sue for peace, eliminating one enemy and allowing Napoleon to focus entirely on the Austrians. Success bred success as Napoleon's army gained confidence and momentum. The capture of Milan brought enormous prestige and valuable resources, while victories at Lodi, Castiglione, and Arcola established Napoleon's reputation as a tactical genius capable of achieving the impossible. His bulletins describing these triumphs were published throughout France, making him a household name and popular hero at a time when the Directory desperately needed good news. The wealth Napoleon extracted from conquered Italian territories solved many of the Directory's financial problems, while funding further military operations. Unlike previous commanders who had focused primarily on military objectives, Napoleon understood that war must serve political and economic purposes. The millions of francs in tribute, the artistic treasures shipped to Paris, and the commercial concessions granted to French merchants all contributed to his value in the eyes of his political superiors. Perhaps most importantly, the Italian campaigns demonstrated Napoleon's ability to combine military action with diplomatic initiatives. Rather than simply conquering territory, he negotiated with local rulers, established client republics, and created a political structure that would outlast his immediate military presence. His correspondence with the Directory revealed a sophisticated understanding of international relations and a confidence in his own judgment that sometimes bordered on insubordination. The peace negotiations with Austria that culminated in the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 showed Napoleon's diplomatic skills in action. Rather than accepting the limited terms the Directory had authorized, he negotiated a comprehensive settlement that expanded French influence throughout northern Italy while securing Austrian recognition of French conquests in the Rhineland. The treaty was a diplomatic triumph that enhanced Napoleon's reputation as much as his military victories had. By the time he returned to Paris in late 1797, Napoleon had transformed himself from a promising young general into a national hero whose popularity rivaled that of the government itself. The Directory found itself in the uncomfortable position of depending on a subordinate whose achievements had made him virtually untouchable politically. For Napoleon, this was exactly the position he had sought, the leverage he needed to shape his own destiny and pursue even grander ambitions. The Egyptian expedition of 1798 represented Napoleon's boldest gamble yet. A campaign designed to strike at British interests in the East while building his own legend as a conqueror in the tradition of Alexander the Great. The strategic rationale was compelling. Egypt controlled the routes to India, where British commercial interests were most vulnerable. But the real motivation was Napoleon's recognition that he needed spectacular achievements to maintain his political position at home. The expedition to Egypt was audacious beyond measure. While the Directory saw it as a way to strike at British commerce and potentially remove a politically dangerous general from France, Napoleon envisioned something far grander. He wasn't just planning a military campaign, he was orchestrating a scientific and cultural expedition that would rival the greatest achievements of antiquity. The fleet that assembled at Toulon carried not only 38,000 soldiers, but also a commission of scholars, artists, engineers, and scientists whose mission was to unlock the secrets of ancient civilization. Napoleon's selection of the expedition's intellectual component revealed his sophisticated understanding of how conquest could be transformed into lasting influence. The Commission of Arts and Sciences included mathematicians like Gaspard Monge and Joseph Fourier, chemists like Claude Berthollet, and artists like Dominique Vivant-Denon. Their presence served multiple purposes, lending legitimacy to what might otherwise appear as mere territorial aggrandizement, while ensuring that French achievements in Egypt would be documented and celebrated for posterity. The strategic deception required to launch the expedition demonstrated Napoleon's growing mastery of both military and political theatre. Admiral Nelson's British fleet controlled the Mediterranean, making any large-scale French naval operation extraordinarily risky. Napoleon solved this problem through misdirection and timing, allowing rumours to circulate about possible destinations while maintaining absolute secrecy about the true objective until the last possible moment. Even his own officers remained ignorant of their destination until the fleet was well at sea. The capture of Malta on June 12, 1798, provided both a strategic base and a demonstration of Napoleon's evolving approach to governance. Rather than simply occupying the island, he implemented comprehensive reforms that abolished feudalism, established civil equality, and created modern administrative structures. The Knights of Malta, who had ruled the island for centuries, found themselves swept aside by revolutionary principles backed by overwhelming force. It was a preview of how Napoleon would later restructure entire nations according to his vision of rational government. The landing in Egypt near Alexandria on July 1, 1798, marked the beginning of one of history's most extraordinary campaigns. The army that disembarked faced challenges unlike anything they'd encountered in European warfare. The desert climate was brutal, water sources were scarce, and the enemy they faced fought according to tactics and traditions completely foreign to European military experience. The Mameluke warriors who controlled Egypt were superb horsemen and individual fighters, but their feudal military organisation was no match for disciplined European infantry and artillery. The Battle of the Pyramids, on July 21, 1798, showcased Napoleon's tactical adaptability and his genius for dramatic presentation. Facing a Mameluke cavalry charge across the desert plains near Cairo, he formed his infantry into massive squares that bristled with bayonets and artillery. As the enemy horsemen thundered toward these formations, Napoleon reportedly told his soldiers that 40 centuries of history were looking down upon them from the nearby pyramids. The battle was a crushing victory that opened the road to Cairo, but more importantly, it created a legend that would inspire French soldiers for decades to come. The occupation of Cairo revealed Napoleon's remarkable ability to adapt to completely different cultural and political environments. Rather than imposing French customs wholesale, he studied Islamic law and tradition, consulting with religious scholars and local leaders to understand how French rule could be made acceptable to the Egyptian population. He even went so far as to suggest that he and his army might convert to Islam if it would facilitate their acceptance, a proposal that scandalized his Christian soldiers but demonstrated his pragmatic approach to conquest. The scientific work conducted during the Egyptian campaign produced discoveries that revolutionized European understanding of ancient civilization. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by Pierre-François Bouchard in August 1799, would eventually unlock the secrets of hieroglyphic writing and open up 3,000 years of Egyptian history to scholarly investigation. The detailed surveys and documentation conducted by the Commission of Arts and Sciences formed the basis for the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a work that established Egyptology as a scholarly discipline. However, the strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly despite these cultural and scientific achievements. Admiral Nelson's destruction of the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile on August 1, 1798, cut Napoleon's communications with France and trapped his army in Egypt. The victory that had initially seemed so complete was beginning to feel like an elaborate prison, with Turkish and British forces gathering to drive the French from their conquests. The Syrian campaign of 1799 represented Napoleon's attempt to break out of the strategic trap that was closing around him. By advancing into Ottoman territory and threatening Damascus and Constantinople, he hoped to force the Turks to negotiate while potentially opening new routes back to Europe. The campaign began promisingly with the capture of El Arish and Gaza, but it culminated in the disastrous siege of Acre, where Ottoman resistance supported by British naval power proved insurmountable. The siege of Acre lasted from March to May 1799 and marked one of the few clear defeats of Napoleon's career. Despite repeated assaults that cost thousands of French casualties, the fortress held firm under the direction of Ahmad Pasha al-Jazar and the British naval commander Sidney Smith. The failure forced Napoleon to abandon his Syrian campaign and retreat to Egypt, leaving behind his wounded and much of his artillery. For the first time, the aura of invincibility that surrounded his name had been tarnished. The outbreak of plague among his troops during the Syrian campaign created a crisis that tested Napoleon's leadership in the most fundamental way. As soldiers died in agony and survivors faced the terror of contagion, maintaining discipline and morale required extraordinary measures. Napoleon's decision to visit plague hospitals personally, touching infected soldiers, and dismissing fears of contagion became one of the most famous episodes of his Egyptian sojourn. Whether driven by genuine courage or calculated theatre, the gesture had enormous impact on his troops' loyalty and his own legendary reputation. News from Europe, when it finally reached Egypt through British and Ottoman sources, painted a picture of crisis that demanded immediate attention. The Directory was facing new coalitions of enemies, military defeats in Italy, and Germany had reversed many of Napoleon's earlier conquests, and political instability in Paris threatened the survival of the revolutionary government. For a general whose entire career had been built on seizing opportunities, the situation presented both danger and unprecedented possibilities. The decision to abandon the army of Egypt and return to France was perhaps the most controversial choice of Napoleon's career. Leaving his soldiers behind while he pursued political advancement appeared to violate every code of military honour, and his enemies would use the abandonment against him for years to come. Yet from a strategic perspective, the decision was brilliant. The army in Egypt was doomed regardless of his presence, while his absence from France during a critical period could have cost him everything he had worked to achieve. The journey back to France required all of Napoleon's skills in deception and navigation. British naval patrols controlled the eastern Mediterranean, making any attempt to reach a French port extraordinarily dangerous. The small frigate that carried Napoleon and his chosen companions had to evade enemy squadrons while navigating by night and sheltering in neutral harbours during daylight hours. The voyage that should have taken days stretched into weeks of constant anxiety and near captures. His arrival in France on October 9th, 1799, created a sensation that exceeded even his return from Italy. The Egyptian expedition, despite its strategic failure, had captured the public imagination in ways that conventional European campaigns could never match. The exotic setting, the scientific discoveries, and the romantic association with ancient pharaohs and biblical history transformed military setbacks into cultural triumphs. Napoleon found himself more popular than ever, precisely when France needed strong leadership most desperately. The political situation that greeted Napoleon's return was chaotic beyond description. The Directory had lost credibility through military failures and economic mismanagement, but no alternative government commanded broad support. Royalist conspiracies threatened from the right, while Jacobin radicals agitated from the left, and foreign armies occupied much of the territory the revolution had conquered. The constitutional system established in 1795 was clearly failing, but any change risked civil war or foreign intervention. The coup d'état of 18 Brumaire, November 9th, 1799, was the culmination of weeks of careful planning by politicians desperate to save the Republic from collapse. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, and other moderate Republicans saw Napoleon as the ideal military figure to provide legitimacy and force for their constitutional reforms. They envisioned a limited role for the general, expecting him to serve as a prestigious but controllable figurehead, while civilian politicians retained real power. Napoleon's participation in the coup was characteristically calculating and decisive. He understood that the conspirators needed him more than he needed them, and he was prepared to use that leverage to secure a dominant position in whatever government emerged. The dramatic confrontation in the Council of 500, where deputies shouted, "Down with the dictator," and Napoleon was physically assaulted, demonstrated both the risks he was taking and his willingness to face them for the sake of ultimate power. The establishment of the consulate on November 10th, 1799, marked the effective end of the French Revolution as a democratic experiment. While the new constitution maintained republican forms and rhetoric, real power was concentrated in the hands of the first consul, a position that Napoleon designed specifically for himself. His fellow consuls, Sieyès and Roger Ducos, quickly discovered that their influence was purely ceremonial, as Napoleon assumed control of all major decisions regarding policy and administration. The transformation of revolutionary France into a modern centralized state began immediately under Napoleon's leadership. The chaotic administrative system that had evolved during the revolution was swept away and replaced with a rational hierarchy of prefects and sub-prefects appointed by the central government. Local autonomy, which had flourished during the early revolutionary period, was sacrificed to efficiency and uniformity as Napoleon imposed his vision of good government throughout the country. The Concordat of 1801 represented one of Napoleon's most politically astute achievements, reconciling the Catholic Church with revolutionary France without abandoning the principle of religious freedom. By negotiating directly with Pope Pius VII, Napoleon ended the schism that had divided French Catholics since the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790. The agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens while maintaining state control over church appointments and finances. The creation of the Napoleonic Code represented perhaps the most enduring achievement of the consulate period. Drawing on Roman law, revolutionary legislation, and practical experience, the new legal code established clear principles for civil rights, property ownership, and family relations that would influence legal systems around the world. Napoleon's personal involvement in the code's development was extensive, attending many of the drafting sessions and contributing his own practical wisdom to complex legal questions. Educational reform under the consulate laid the foundation for France's modern school system, while serving Napoleon's broader goals of creating a meritocratic society. The establishment of lycées provided advanced education for talented students, regardless of their social background, while the University of France created a centralized system for training teachers and administrators. These institutions produced the educated professionals and loyal bureaucrats that Napoleon needed to govern his expanding empire. The military reforms implemented during this period transformed the French army into the most effective fighting force in Europe. The amalgamation of revolutionary volunteers with regular soldiers created units that combined professional skill with patriotic enthusiasm, while new tactical doctrines emphasized speed, flexibility, and the concentrated use of artillery. The creation of the Grande Armée brought together French soldiers with allied contingents from across Europe under unified command and standardized procedures. Economic recovery under the consulate provided the financial foundation for all of Napoleon's subsequent achievements. The establishment of the Bank of France stabilized the currency and restored confidence in government finances, while continental trade policies protected French industries and generated revenue through customs duties. the indemnities extracted from defeated enemies, and the wealth drawn from conquered territories funded military expansion while reducing the tax burden on French citizens. The plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise on December 24, 1800, demonstrated that Napoleon faced serious opposition despite his growing popularity and administrative success. The explosion that narrowly missed killing the first consul as he travelled to the opera was the work of royalist conspirators who saw assassination as the only way to restore the Bourbon monarchy. The incident provided Napoleon with justification for increased security measures and the elimination of political opponents who might threaten the stability of his regime. The Battle of Marengo on June 14, 1800, restored Napoleon's military reputation and secured French dominance in northern Italy. The victory was nearly a disaster, as Austrian forces under General Melas initially drove the French from the field and came close to achieving complete success. Only the timely arrival of Louis Desire with reinforcements and a desperate afternoon counterattack saved Napoleon from humiliating defeat. The battle's outcome demonstrated both the risks of Napoleon's aggressive tactics and his ability to recover from apparently hopeless situations. The Peace of Amiens, signed on March 25, 1802, brought a temporary end to the war that had consumed Europe for nearly a decade. While the treaty restored most colonial possessions to their pre-war owners and required France to respect the independence of several Italian republics, it also recognized French conquests in Europe and allowed Napoleon to consolidate his domestic reforms without external pressure. The peace was popular in France and Britain, where war-weary populations welcomed any respite from conflict and economic disruption. The establishment of the Legion of Honor in 1802 revealed Napoleon's sophisticated understanding of human motivation and social psychology. By creating a new system of rewards based on merit rather than birth, he provided ambitious individuals throughout French society with incentives to serve the state loyally and effectively. The Legion included both military and civilian categories, recognizing achievements in science, arts, and administration alongside battlefield heroism. The transformation of the consulate into the empire represented the logical culmination of Napoleon's accumulation of power since 1799. The plebiscite of 1804 that approved his elevation to emperor provided democratic legitimacy for what was essentially a return to monarchy, while the elaborate coronation ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral linked the new regime to both revolutionary principles and traditional pageantry. Napoleon's decision to crown himself rather than accept coronation from Pope Pius VII symbolized his independence from all external authority. The creation of a new nobility under the empire demonstrated Napoleon's pragmatic approach to social organization. While the titles he granted carried no feudal privileges and remained dependent on continued service to the state, they satisfied the human desire for distinction and hierarchy that egalitarian rhetoric could never eliminate. Marshals, ministers, and administrators received ducal and comtal titles that enhanced their prestige while binding them more closely to Napoleon's regime. The continental system, launched in 1806, represented Napoleon's most ambitious attempt to defeat Britain through economic warfare rather than military conquest. By closing European ports to British goods and encouraging the development of continental industries, he hoped to strangle British commerce while creating a self-sufficient European economy under French leadership. The system's implementation required extensive diplomatic and military pressure on reluctant allies, ultimately contributing to the conflicts that would destroy Napoleon's empire. Napoleon's empire. The enforcement of the continental system exposed the fundamental contradictions within Napoleon's European empire. While France benefited from reduced British competition and expanded markets for French goods, The economic hardships imposed on other nations created resentment that would eventually explode into open rebellion. Portugal's refusal to comply with the trade restrictions provided the immediate pretext for the Peninsular War, but the underlying tensions stretched across the continent from Hamburg to Naples. The invasion of Portugal in 1807 marked the beginning of Napoleon's most costly strategic error. Rather than accepting Portuguese non-compliance as a manageable problem, he chose to enforce his economic system through military occupation. The campaign that began as a simple police action to close Lisbon's ports to British ships gradually expanded into a massive commitment that would drain French resources for 6 years and create a permanent drain on military manpower. The Spanish alliance that facilitated the Portuguese invasion quickly deteriorated into another source of conflict when Napoleon decided that the Bourbon monarchy in Madrid was insufficiently reliable. The abdications of Charles IV and Ferdinand VII at Bayonne in 1808 seemed to offer an elegant solution, placing Napoleon's brother Joseph on the Spanish throne while avoiding the costs of direct occupation. The arrangement satisfied legal formalities and appeared to guarantee Spanish cooperation with French policies. However, the Spanish people's reaction to their new king shattered Napoleon's assumptions about how conquered populations would respond to rational government and material improvements. The uprising that began in Madrid on May 2, 1808, spread rapidly throughout the country, creating a form of resistance that European armies had never encountered. Guerrilla warfare, conducted by irregular forces with intimate knowledge of local terrain and passionate commitment to their cause, proved far more difficult to suppress than conventional military opposition. The capitulation of General Dupont at Bailly on July 19, 1808, sent shockwaves throughout Europe and demonstrated that French armies were not invincible. For the first time since the Revolutionary Wars began, an entire French corps had been forced to surrender in the field, and the psychological impact was enormous. Allied governments that had resigned themselves to French hegemony began reconsidering their options, while French generals questioned whether Napoleon's methods could succeed against every form of resistance. The British intervention in Portugal under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, transformed a peripheral conflict into a major theatre that would ultimately contribute to Napoleon's downfall. The small expeditionary force that landed at Mondigo Bay in August 1808 grew steadily as British resources and Portuguese cooperation created a secure base for operations against French forces throughout Iberia. Wellington's defensive strategy, based on strong positions and careful logistics, proved perfectly suited to the peninsula's terrain and political conditions. Napoleon's personal intervention in Spain during the winter of 1808 to 1809 demonstrated his continued tactical brilliance, while revealing the limitations of even his extraordinary abilities. The rapid campaign that recaptured Madrid and drove British forces to Corunna was a masterpiece of operational art, but it could not resolve the fundamental problem of governing a hostile population with insufficient military resources. The Emperor's return to France after just 4 months in Spain reflected his recognition that other theatres demanded his personal attention. The Wagram campaign of 1809 showed that Austria remained determined to challenge French hegemony, despite repeated defeats and humiliating peace settlements. Archduke Charles had spent the interval since Austerlitz reforming the Austrian army along French lines, creating a more flexible and effective force that could potentially match Napoleon's tactical innovations. The Austrian declaration of war in April 1809 opened a new phase of the Napoleonic Wars that would test both sides' capacity for sustained conflict. The Battle of Aspern-Essling on May 21st to 22nd, 1809, provided Napoleon with his first clear tactical defeat on a European battlefield. The Austrian army's successful defence of the Danube crossings demonstrated that French methods could be countered by competent opponents with adequate preparation and favourable terrain. The heavy French casualties and Napoleon's forced withdrawal shattered the myth of his tactical invincibility and encouraged further resistance throughout Europe. The subsequent victory at Wagram on July 5 to 6, 1809, restored French military prestige, but at a cost that revealed the changing nature of Napoleonic warfare. The massive artillery bombardment that broke Austrian resistance required unprecedented concentrations of guns and ammunition, while casualty levels on both sides exceeded anything seen in earlier campaigns. The battle's outcome secured another favourable peace treaty, but the resources required to achieve victory suggested that future conflicts would be even more demanding. The marriage alliance with Austria that followed the Peace of Schönbrunn represented both the pinnacle of Napoleon's diplomatic achievement and the beginning of his personal isolation from the revolutionary principles that had originally legitimized his rule. The divorce from Josephine, who had shared his rise to power, and the marriage to Marie-Louise, daughter of his former enemy, Emperor Francis, symbolized the transformation of the revolutionary general into a traditional dynastic ruler seeking legitimacy through royal bloodlines. The birth of Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, on March 20th, 1811, seemed to guarantee the continuation of the Bonaparte dynasty while raising new questions about the empire's future direction. The infant's existence provided Napoleon with the heir he had long desired, but it also created obligations and considerations that conflicted with the aggressive expansionism that had built his power. The responsibilities of fatherhood and dynasty sat uneasily with the restless energy that had driven his earlier achievements. The Russian alliance that had emerged from the Treaty of Tilsit gradually deteriorated as both emperors pursued conflicting interests that could not be reconciled through diplomatic compromise. Alexander's withdrawal from the continental system, his annexation of Oldenburg, and his independent policies in Poland all challenged Napoleon's vision of European order under French leadership. The breakdown of personal friendship between the two emperors reflected deeper incompatibilities between Russian and French strategic objectives. The economic pressures created by the continental system were undermining French prosperity despite initial benefits to domestic industries. The shortage of colonial goods, the disruption of traditional trade routes, and the costs of enforcing economic restrictions throughout Europe were creating popular discontent that threatened the stability of Napoleon's regime. The emperor's recognition that military conquest could not solve fundamental economic problems led him to consider increasingly desperate measures to force British submission. The Grande Armée that assembled for the Russian campaign in 1812 represented the largest military force ever concentrated under a single commander in European history. More than 600,000 soldiers from across the continent marched toward the Russian frontier, including French veterans, German allies, Italian conscripts, and Polish volunteers united only in their service to Napoleon's ambitions. The army's multinational character reflected both the scope of French influence and the political fragility of the coalition that sustained it. The strategic plan for the Russian invasion assumed that a rapid advance on Moscow would force Alexander to negotiate before winter weather made campaigning impossible. Napoleon's previous experience suggested that decisive battles, followed by the occupation of enemy capitals, produced favourable peace settlements, and he saw no reason why the same approach would not succeed against Russia. The campaign's timing and objectives reflected his confidence that European warfare followed predictable patterns that his methods could exploit. The crossing of the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, marked the beginning of the most ambitious and ultimately disastrous campaign of Napoleon's career. The massive logistical challenges of supplying such an enormous force across the vast distances of Eastern Europe were compounded by the Russian strategy of trading space for time, while avoiding the decisive battles that Napoleon desperately needed. The emperor's frustration with his enemies' refusal to fight according to conventional military doctrine, grew as his army advanced deeper into hostile territory. The Battle of Borodino on September 7th, 1812, provided the climactic encounter that Napoleon had sought throughout the campaign, but the tactical victory came at a strategic cost that ultimately doomed the entire enterprise. The Russian army's stubborn defense of prepared positions resulted in casualties so severe that both sides were effectively crippled, while the French advance to Moscow achieved nothing more than the occupation of an abandoned and soon-to-be burning city. The Pyrrhic nature of the victory demonstrated that Napoleon's tactical methods had reached their limits against an enemy willing to accept unlimited losses. The retreat from Moscow, beginning in October 1812, became one of history's greatest military disasters, as supply failures, partisan attacks, and brutal weather conditions destroyed the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée that had crossed the Niemen with such confidence disintegrated into a mob of starving refugees pursued by Cossack raiders and Russian regulars. Napoleon's decision to abandon his army and race back to Paris to organise new forces marked the effective end of French hegemony in Europe. The German campaign of 1813 represented Napoleon's last opportunity to preserve his empire through military victory. But the coalition arrayed against him now included virtually every European power except Denmark and a few minor German states. The battles of Lutzen, Bautzen and Dresden showed that the emperor retained his tactical genius, but his enemies had learned to avoid decisive engagements while coordinating their forces to exploit French weaknesses. The strategy of attrition that had succeeded in Russia was now being applied across Central Europe. The defection of Bavaria and other German allies during the Leipzig campaign demonstrated that Napoleon's empire was built on foundations too weak to survive sustained pressure. The Battle of the Nations from October 16th to 19th, 1813, became the largest engagement of the entire Napoleonic period, as over 500,000 soldiers from across Europe converged on the Saxon city. The French defeat was inevitable, given the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies, but Napoleon's tactical skill prolonged the contest and allowed much of his army to escape westward. The invasion of France in 1814 brought the consequences of 20 years of warfare home to the French people for the first time since the revolutionary period. The campaign that Napoleon conducted against overwhelming odds showcased his military genius at its finest, as he won a series of brilliant victories against separated Allied columns despite commanding forces barely 1/10 the size of the enemy coalition. The 6 Days campaign in particular demonstrated that tactical brilliance could still achieve miraculous results, even under the most adverse strategic circumstances. However, political support for continued resistance was crumbling as French society grew weary of endless warfare and economic hardship. The Senate's declaration that Napoleon had forfeited the throne reflected not just Allied pressure, but genuine popular desire for peace at almost any cost. The Emperor's abdication at Fontainebleau on April 6, 1814, marked the end of an era that had transformed Europe more completely than any period since the fall of the Roman Empire. The exile to Elba provided Napoleon with a sovereign principality where he could exercise his administrative talents on a miniature scale while contemplating the dramatic reversal of his fortunes. The island's small size and limited resources offered little scope for the grandiose projects that had characterized his earlier career, but they also allowed him to experiment with reforms and improvements that demonstrated his continued vitality and ambition. The boredom and frustration of ruling 12,000 subjects after commanding an empire of 40 million proved unbearable for someone of his temperament. The 100 days that began with Napoleon's landing at Golfe-Juan on March 1st, 1815, represented his final gamble for power and glory. The enthusiasm that greeted his return to France suggested that his legend remained powerful despite the disasters of recent years. While his rapid march to Paris without firing a shot demonstrated that popular support for the Bourbon restoration was weaker than the Allies had assumed. The Emperor's ability to reclaim his throne through sheer force of personality was perhaps his most remarkable achievement. The reconstruction of the Grande Armée during the 100 Days showcased Napoleon's extraordinary ability to mobilize resources and inspire loyalty even after catastrophic defeat. Within weeks of his return to Paris, he had assembled a force of nearly 300,000 men, combining veterans who had served in his earlier campaigns with new recruits, eager to share in the glory of his restored empire. The speed with which this military machine materialized demonstrated both the efficiency of French administrative systems and the enduring appeal of Napoleon's leadership among professional soldiers. The diplomatic situation facing the restored emperor was far more challenging than the military recruitment that had proceeded so smoothly. The Congress of Vienna, which had been reorganizing Europe in his absence, immediately declared him an outlaw and renewed the coalition that had driven him from power the previous year. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia pledged to maintain 800,000 troops in the field until Napoleon was permanently eliminated as a threat to European stability. The emperor found himself facing the united opposition of virtually every major power on the continent. Napoleon's strategy for the Waterloo campaign reflected his recognition that time worked against him as Allied armies concentrated for a coordinated assault on France. Rather than waiting for the inevitable invasion, he chose to strike first at the Anglo-Prussian forces gathering in Belgium, hoping that a decisive victory would fracture the coalition and force his enemies to negotiate. The plan required perfect timing and execution, as any delay would allow Wellington and Blücher to coordinate their movements and concentrate overwhelming force against the French advance. The crossing of the frontier on June 15, 1815, achieved complete tactical surprise as Napoleon's army advanced between the separated Allied forces before they could establish effective communications. The Emperor's ability to move large numbers of troops without detection demonstrated that his skills in operational planning remained as sharp as ever, while the initial success at Charleroi suggested that his final campaign might achieve the dramatic reversal of fortune that he desperately needed. The Battle of Ligny on June 16th provided Napoleon with his last victory on European soil, as his forces defeated Blücher's Prussians in a hard-fought engagement that seemed to validate his strategic concept. The Prussian withdrawal opened the road to Brussels while potentially eliminating one of the two enemy armies from the campaign. However, the incomplete nature of the victory allowed most of Blücher's force to escape destruction, and the failure to pursue aggressively would prove crucial in the campaign's final phase. The simultaneous engagement at Quatre Bras revealed the limitations of divided command, as Marshal Ney's wing failed to achieve decisive results against Wellington's advance guard. The inconclusive nature of both battles on June 16th left Napoleon facing the same strategic problem that had confronted him at the campaign's outset, with enemy forces still capable of mutual support despite his initial success in separating them. The Emperor's decision to concentrate against Wellington while dispatching Grouchy to pursue the Prussians reflected his belief that the British force represented the more dangerous opponent. The morning of June 18th, 1815, found the two armies facing each other across the muddy fields near the village of Waterloo, with Napoleon confident that his tactical superiority would overcome Wellington's defensive advantages. The Emperor's battle plan was characteristically straightforward, relying on artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault to break the enemy line before British reinforcements could arrive. The delay in beginning the attack, caused by the need to allow the ground to dry after heavy overnight rain, would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. The initial French attacks achieved partial success as d'Erlon's corps penetrated Wellington's centre, and Ney's cavalry charges threatened to break the British squares. However, The stubborn resistance of veteran British infantry and the timely arrival of Prussian forces on the French right flank gradually shifted the battle's momentum against Napoleon. The Emperor's increasing desperation was evident in his commitment of the Imperial Guard, his last reserve, in a final attempt to achieve the breakthrough that would secure victory. The repulse of the Guard's attack marked the psychological turning point of the battle as the cry, "La Garde recule," spread panic through French ranks that had never seen their elite units retreat. Wellington's general advance, coordinated with Blucher's assault on the French right, transformed an orderly withdrawal into a complete rout that destroyed Napoleon's army as an effective fighting force. The Emperor's escape from the battlefield preserved his person, but could not salvage his political position or his dynasty's future. The return to Paris after Waterloo revealed that Napoleon's political support had evaporated as completely as his military power. The Chamber of Deputies refused to support continued resistance, while public opinion had turned decisively against further warfare that could only bring foreign occupation and national humiliation. The Emperor's second abdication on June 22, 1815, lacked the dramatic character of his first, reflecting the exhaustion and disillusionment that had replaced the enthusiasm of his return from Elba. The negotiations surrounding Napoleon's final exile demonstrated the Allies' determination to prevent any repetition of the 100 Days episode. The selection of St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, reflected careful calculation of geographic and political factors that would make escape impossible, while ensuring that the fallen emperor could not become a rallying point for French opposition to the restored Bourbon monarchy. The British government's assumption of responsibility for Napoleon's custody reflected both their naval supremacy and their particular interest in preventing his return to power. The voyage to St. Helena aboard HMS Northumberland provided Napoleon with time to reflect on the extraordinary trajectory of his career and to begin shaping the legend that would outlive his physical existence. His conversations with fellow passengers and his dictated memoirs revealed a man determined to present his achievements in the most favourable light while minimising the costs of his ambitions. The process of mythologization that would transform the exile into a romantic hero began even before his arrival at his final prison. Life on St. Helena was constrained by the British government's determination to prevent any possibility of escape or rescue. The island's garrison was substantial. Naval patrols monitored the surrounding waters, and Napoleon's movements were severely restricted despite his nominal status as a prisoner of state rather than a common criminal. The elaborate precautions reflected both the exile's continued charisma and the authorities' awareness that his supporters throughout Europe remained numerous and potentially dangerous. The Governor Sir Hudson Lowe's interpretation of his instructions created constant friction with Napoleon over questions of protocol, correspondence, and daily routine. The former emperor's insistence on being treated according to his imperial dignity conflicted with Lowe's responsibility to maintain security and prevent any activity that might facilitate escape or political communication. These petty disputes, magnified by the isolation and boredom of exile, dominated the final years of Napoleon's life. The composition of his memoirs became Napoleon's primary occupation as he sought to shape historical understanding of his career and to justify the decisions that had led to his downfall. The dictated accounts of his campaigns, political achievements, and personal philosophy revealed both his continued intellectual vitality and his determination to influence posterity's judgment. The process of dictation to loyal companions like Las Cases, Montholon, and Bertrand created a body of material that would fuel Napoleon's legend for generations. The exile's health began deteriorating significantly in 1819 as stomach problems that had troubled him for years became increasingly severe. The limited medical knowledge of the period made accurate diagnosis impossible, while the isolation of St. Helena prevented consultation with specialists who might have provided effective treatment. The debate over whether Napoleon was suffering from cancer, poisoning, or other conditions would continue long after his death, adding another layer of mystery to his legend. The political changes sweeping Europe during Napoleon's exile demonstrated the continuing influence of ideas and institutions he had established during his years of power. The revolutions of 1820 in Spain and Italy, the Greek struggle for independence, and the growing demands for constitutional government throughout the continent all reflected principles that Napoleon had championed and implemented. His example continued to inspire both liberals seeking political reform and nationalists challenging foreign domination. The former emperor's correspondence with sympathizers throughout Europe, despite official restrictions, revealed his continued engagement with political developments and his hope that changing circumstances might create opportunities for his return. The letters smuggled off St. Helena contained not only personal messages, but also political commentary and strategic analysis that demonstrated his undiminished interest in shaping events beyond his island prison. The gradual erosion of the European settlement established in 1815 suggested to Napoleon that the Allies' unity was fragile and that new conflicts might create possibilities for French resurgence under Bonaparte leadership. The diplomatic tensions between Britain and the continental powers, the economic difficulties facing restored monarchies, and the persistence of revolutionary sentiment all indicated that the post-Waterloo order might prove temporary. Napoleon's relationship with his son, the Duke of Reichstadt, living under Austrian supervision in Vienna, became a source of both hope and frustration during the exile years. The former emperor's letters to Marie-Louise and his attempts to influence his child's education reflected his desire to preserve the Bonaparte dynasty while recognizing the practical impossibility of direct communication. The knowledge that his heir was being raised as an Austrian archduke rather than a French prince added personal anguish to political disappointment. The final months of Napoleon's life were marked by increasing physical weakness and growing reconciliation with mortality. The former emperor, who had commanded millions of soldiers and governed vast territories, found himself reduced to the most basic human concerns of pain, memory, and approaching death. His last will and testament, dictated in April 1821, revealed both his continued pride in his achievements and his acceptance that his extraordinary career had reached its inevitable conclusion. The death of Napoleon Bonaparte on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, marked the end of an era that had transformed Europe more completely than any period since the fall of Rome. The former emperor's final words, reportedly, "France Army, Head of the Army, Josephine," summarized the passions that had driven his remarkable life, while suggesting the human emotions that had persisted beneath the imperial grandeur. The news of his death, when it reached Europe weeks later, prompted complex reactions that ranged from relief among his former enemies to genuine grief among those who had served his cause. The immediate aftermath of Napoleon's death revealed the continuing power of his legend, even as his physical presence was removed from the political equation. The British authorities' careful handling of his funeral and burial reflected their awareness that the exile's death might create a martyr whose influence could prove more dangerous than his living presence had been. The simple ceremony conducted on St. Helena contrasted sharply with the elaborate pageantry that had characterized the emperor's public appearances during his years of power. The return of Napoleon's remains to France in 1840, orchestrated by King Louis Philippe's government, demonstrated the extent to which the Bonaparte legend had been rehabilitated in French popular consciousness. The spectacular funeral procession through Paris and the elaborate tomb constructed at Les Invalides transformed the former emperor into a national icon whose achievements were celebrated while the costs of his ambitions were conveniently forgotten. The ceremony marked the beginning of a mythologization process that would make Napoleon one of history's most enduring figures. The influence of Napoleon's legal and administrative reforms extended far beyond his death, as the codes and institutions he had established continued to shape governance throughout Europe and beyond. The Napoleonic Code became a model for legal systems across the globe, while his educational and administrative innovations influenced the development of modern state structures in dozens of countries. The practical achievements of his rule proved more durable than his military conquests, creating a legacy that outlasted the political arrangements established by his enemies. The strategic and tactical innovations Napoleon had introduced continued to influence military thinking throughout the 19th century and beyond. Professional armies worldwide studied his campaigns for insights into operational planning, battlefield tactics, and the coordination of different military branches. The emperor's emphasis on mobility, concentration of force, and decisive action became standard doctrine for generations of officers who had never served under his command. The Romantic movement that swept European culture during the decades following Napoleon's death drew heavily on his legend as an example of individual genius transcending conventional limitations. Writers, artists, and musicians found in his story the perfect embodiment of romantic ideals about passion, ambition, and the triumph of will over circumstance. The transformation of the practical politician and military commander into a romantic hero represented one of history's most successful exercises in myth-making. The democratic and nationalist movements that characterized 19th century European politics often invoked Napoleon's example as justification for their own revolutionary activities. The emperor's career demonstrated that dramatic political change was possible, and that traditional authorities could be overthrown by determined individuals with popular support. The legend of Napoleon became inseparable from the broader narrative of European democratization and national liberation. The Industrial Revolution that transformed European society during the decades after Waterloo was facilitated by many of the legal and educational changes Napoleon had introduced during his years of power. The emphasis on merit over birth, the standardization of weights and measures, and the improvement of transportation infrastructure all contributed to economic modernization that might have proceeded more slowly under traditional systems. The emperor's practical achievements created conditions that fostered the very changes he might not have anticipated or desired. The scientific revolution that swept through European universities and academies during the post-Napoleonic era owed much to the emperor's own passion for empirical investigation and rational inquiry. His creation of technical schools and emphasis on mathematical education had produced a generation of engineers, scientists, and administrators who approached problems with the analytical methods he had championed. The metric system he had promoted became the foundation for international scientific collaboration, while the scholarly expeditions he had sponsored established new standards for systematic research and documentation. The memory of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign continued to inspire archaeological and anthropological investigations throughout the 19th century as European scholars sought to unlock the secrets of ancient civilizations. The scientific approach he had pioneered, combining military objectives with scholarly research, became a model for later expeditions to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The Description de l'Égypte remained the standard reference work for decades, demonstrating how conquest could be transformed into lasting intellectual achievements. Military engineering advanced rapidly during the decades following Napoleon's death, as armies worldwide adopted the fortification techniques and siege methods his campaigns had perfected. The emperor's integration of artillery, infantry, and cavalry into coordinated tactical systems influenced military doctrine across Europe and America, while his emphasis on rapid movement and flexible command structures became standard practice for professional armies. The staff systems he had developed provided templates for military organization that remained relevant well into the 20th century. The diplomatic protocols Napoleon had established during his negotiations with European powers created precedents that shaped international relations. Long after his exile, his use of treaties to restructure entire regions, his creation of client states, and his manipulation of nationalist sentiment provided lessons that future statesmen would study and adapt. The concept of balance of power that emerged from the Congress of Vienna was itself a reaction to Napoleon's demonstration of what could be achieved through aggressive diplomacy backed by military force. Educational institutions throughout Europe adopted curricula and methods derived from Napoleon's reforms of French schools and universities. The emphasis on practical subjects, competitive examinations, and merit-based advancement spread far beyond France's borders, as other nations recognized the advantages of systematic education over traditional aristocratic privilege. The lycée system he had created became a model for secondary education that influenced school development across the continent and in European colonies worldwide. The economic theories that emerged during the Industrial Revolution often referenced Napoleon's attempts to create a continental trading system as either positive or negative examples of state intervention in commerce. His continental system, despite its ultimate failure, had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of economic warfare, while his promotion of French industries had shown how government policy could stimulate technological innovation and commercial development. Economists and political theorists continue to debate the lessons of his economic experiments decades after his death. Urban planning and public works projects throughout 19th century Europe reflected the influence of Napoleon's transformation of Paris and other French cities during his reign. The broad boulevards, public monuments, and systematic street layouts he had promoted became standard features of modern city design, while his emphasis on sanitation, lighting, and transportation infrastructure established new expectations for urban governance. Cities from London to St. Petersburg adopted elements of the Napoleonic approach to municipal improvement. The medical advances achieved during Napoleon's campaigns, particularly in battlefield surgery and military hygiene, revolutionized healthcare throughout Europe and beyond. The emperor's support for vaccination programs and his army's systematic approach to treating wounded soldiers established new standards for military medicine that influenced civilian medical practice. The hospitals and medical schools he had founded continued to train physicians and surgeons who carried his innovations far beyond France's borders. Prison reform movements throughout the 19th century drew inspiration from Napoleon's reorganization of France's penal system and his emphasis on rehabilitation over purely punitive measures. His legal codes had established new standards for criminal justice that influenced prison design and administration across Europe, while his creation of work programs for convicts provided models for productive imprisonment that reformers would adapt and expand. The humane treatment of prisoners became associated with enlightened governance partly through his example. Agricultural improvements introduced during Napoleon's reign continued to spread throughout European farming communities as his emphasis on scientific methods and crop rotation proved their value over traditional practices. The agricultural schools he had established trained a generation of farmers and estate managers who carried modern techniques to regions that had resisted innovation for centuries. The increased food production that resulted from these improvements helped support the population growth that characterized the Industrial Revolution. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency that Napoleon had imposed throughout his empire created efficiencies that persisted long after political boundaries had been redrawn. Commercial relationships established during the Napoleonic period often survived the restoration of old regimes because merchants and manufacturers had discovered the advantages of dealing with standardized systems. The economic integration his conquests had forced upon reluctant partners laid groundwork for the voluntary commercial cooperation that would emerge later in the century. Religious freedom and civil rights protections established under Napoleonic law influenced constitutional developments throughout Europe as liberals and reformers pointed to French examples of successful religious tolerance and legal equality. The emperor's reconciliation of competing religious traditions had demonstrated that diverse populations could coexist peacefully under secular legal frameworks, while his protection of minority rights had shown how governments could maintain stability while respecting individual conscience. The veterans of Napoleon's armies who scattered across Europe and the Americas after 1815 carried with them not only military expertise, but also political ideas and social attitudes that influenced developments far from the battlefields where they had served. Former French soldiers became military advisors, revolutionary leaders, and colonial administrators who spread Napoleonic concepts of organization and governance to distant corners of the globe. Their experiences under the emperor's command provided them with practical knowledge of how large-scale enterprises could be managed and directed. Art and architecture throughout the 19th century reflected the aesthetic principles Napoleon had promoted during his patronage of artists, sculptors, and architects. The neoclassical style he had favoured became associated with imperial grandeur and civic virtue, influencing public buildings and monuments across Europe and America. Museums and galleries he had established continued to shape artistic taste and cultural education, while the artistic treasures he had assembled in Paris attracted visitors who carried their aesthetic experiences back to their home countries. The engineering projects Napoleon had initiated or completed during his reign established new standards for large-scale construction that influenced infrastructure development throughout the industrial age. Roads, bridges, and canals, built according to his specifications, demonstrated the possibilities of systematic planning and coordinated execution, while the technical schools he had founded produced engineers who carried French expertise to projects worldwide. The transportation networks he had created facilitated commercial development that continued long after his political system had disappeared. Philosophical and political movements that emerged during the decades following Napoleon's death often defined themselves in relation to his legacy, whether as admirers seeking to complete his work or as critics determined to prevent any repetition of his methods. The debates over democracy, nationalism, and individual rights that dominated 19th century political discourse frequently referenced his career as either a positive or negative example of how power could be exercised and limited. His transformation from revolutionary general to imperial autocrat provided material for endless theoretical discussions about the relationship between liberty and authority. The publishing industry that flourished during the 19th century owed much to Napoleon's promotion of literacy and his creation of educational institutions that produced large numbers of potential readers. The newspapers and periodicals he had established during his reign provided models for commercial publishing, while his own prolific correspondence and memoirs demonstrated the market potential for political and military literature. The reading public his educational policies had created became the foundation for the mass media that would emerge later in the century. Colonial administration throughout European empires incorporated techniques and principles derived from Napoleon's governance of conquered territories during his years of expansion. His methods for integrating diverse populations, managing distant provinces, and extracting resources from subject territories provided templates that colonial officials would adapt to circumstances in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The administrative efficiency he had demonstrated influenced imperial policies that would shape global development for generations. Women's rights movements that emerged during the 19th century often referenced the legal protections Napoleon had extended to women in his civil code, while simultaneously criticizing the limitations those same laws had imposed on female independence. The emperor's recognition of women's property rights and his protection of wives and mothers had represented significant advances over traditional practices, but his emphasis on family authority and domestic roles had also reinforced certain restrictions. Feminist theorists found in his legislation both inspiration and targets for reform. The technological innovations that characterized the Industrial Revolution were facilitated by the scientific education and research institutions Napoleon had established during his reign. The emphasis on practical application of theoretical knowledge that he had promoted influenced the development of engineering and manufacturing techniques that transformed European society. Patent systems and industrial policies he had introduced provided frameworks for protecting and encouraging innovation that other nations would adopt and expand. International law and diplomatic practice evolved during the 19th century, partly in response to the precedents Napoleon had established through his treaties, alliances, and territorial arrangements. His use of plebiscites to legitimize political changes, his creation of new states and kingdoms, and his redrawing of ancient boundaries had demonstrated both the possibilities and dangers of radical diplomatic innovation. Legal scholars and international theorists continued to debate the implications of his methods, long after the specific arrangements he created had been superseded. The cultural exchanges that had flourished during Napoleon's empire continued to influence European intellectual development, as scholars, artists, and writers maintained relationships that transcended the political boundaries restored after 1815. The cosmopolitan atmosphere he had created in Paris and other major cities had brought together talent from across the continent, creating networks of collaboration and competition that persisted despite changed political circumstances. The international character of European culture that emerged during the 19th century owed much to the connections his empire had fostered. Banking and financial institutions throughout Europe adopted practices and principles derived from Napoleon's reorganization of French public finances and his creation of the Bank of France. The monetary policies he had implemented and the commercial relationships his empire had established provided models for economic development that influenced financial practice far beyond France's borders. The stability and predictability he had brought to currency and credit markets demonstrated the advantages of systematic financial administration over traditional ad hoc arrangements. The concept of popular sovereignty that had emerged from the French Revolution gained new dimensions through Napoleon's use of plebiscites and his appeals to national sentiment during his various campaigns. His demonstration that political authority could be derived from mass support rather than traditional legitimacy influenced democratic movements throughout Europe and the Americas. The techniques he had developed for mobilizing popular opinion became part of the toolkit available to future political leaders seeking to challenge established authorities. Military academies and staff colleges established throughout Europe and America during the 19th century incorporated curricula and methods derived from Napoleon's own military education and his reforms of French military instruction. The emperor's emphasis on systematic study of warfare, mathematical precision in planning, and practical experience in leadership became standard elements of professional military training. Officers educated according to these principles carried Napoleonic approaches to warfare and administration throughout the expanding global military community. The legend of Napoleon that emerged during the decades following his death transcended the historical facts of his career to become a symbol of human possibility and limitation that would inspire and warn future generations. His story demonstrated both the heights that individual ambition and talent could reach and the catastrophic consequences that could result from unchecked power and overweening pride. The balance between admiration and caution that characterized 19th century assessments of his legacy would continue to influence historical judgment and political thinking well into the modern era. The transformation of Napoleon from historical figure to cultural phenomenon accelerated throughout the 19th century as romantic writers and artists elevated his story to mythic proportions. Victor Hugo's poetry captured the melancholy grandeur of the fallen emperor, while painters like Horace Vernet and Paul Delaroche created iconic images that shaped popular understanding of his character and achievements. The visual language they developed, emphasizing dramatic lighting and heroic poses, established artistic conventions that would influence depictions of political leadership for generations to come. Musical compositions inspired by Napoleon's career became staples of European concert halls, as composers found in his story the perfect subject matter for exploring themes of triumph and tragedy. Beethoven's relationship with Napoleon, from initial dedication to bitter disillusionment, reflected broader European ambivalence about the emperor's legacy. The symphonic works that emerged from this cultural engagement with Napoleonic themes helped establish new forms of programmatic music that would dominate Romantic composition throughout the century. Theatrical productions based on Napoleon's life proliferated across European stages as dramatists discovered that his career provided inexhaustible material for exploring questions of ambition, power, and moral responsibility. The emperor's rise and fall offered perfect dramatic structure, while his complex personality provided rich opportunities for character development that could appeal to audiences across the political spectrum. These theatrical interpretations often revealed more about contemporary concerns than historical accuracy, transforming Napoleon into a mirror for 19th century anxieties about democracy, nationalism, and social change. Educational curricula throughout Europe began incorporating Napoleon's campaigns as case studies in military science, political theory, and historical methodology. The emperor's career demonstrated how individual decisions could reshape entire civilizations, making his story an ideal vehicle for teaching students about cause and effect in human affairs. The systematic study of his methods and their consequences became a standard component of advanced education, ensuring that his influence would persist through generations of scholars and leaders who had never experienced his era directly. The emergence of professional historical scholarship during the 19th century was profoundly influenced by the need to understand and evaluate Napoleon's impact on European development. Historians developed new methods of documentary analysis and archival research, partly in response to the complexity of his legacy and the volume of sources his administration had generated. The critical examination of his policies and their long-term effects established precedents for historical methodology that would influence academic practice well beyond Napoleonic studies. Photography and other new technologies of image reproduction began to supplement painted and engraved portraits of Napoleon, creating a visual record that made his appearance familiar to millions who had never seen artistic representations of him. The proliferation of his image through mass-produced prints and photographs contributed to the development of modern celebrity culture, while demonstrating how political figures could maintain influence through careful management of their public persona. The techniques developed for promoting and preserving Napoleon's image provided templates for political marketing that would be refined and expanded by later leaders. Archaeological investigations inspired by Napoleon's Egyptian expedition continued throughout the 19th century, as European scholars sought to emulate his combination of conquest and scientific discovery. The methods he had pioneered for documenting ancient civilizations became standard practice for archaeological research, while the institutional frameworks he had established for organizing scholarly expeditions influenced the development of professional archaeology as an academic discipline. The scientific legacy of his Middle Eastern campaigns proved more enduring than their military or political consequences. Colonial administrators throughout the expanding European empires drew extensively on Napoleon's experience governing diverse populations across different cultural and religious traditions. His policies for integrating conquered territories and managing ethnic tensions provided practical guidance for officials facing similar challenges in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The administrative techniques he had developed for controlling distant provinces while extracting resources and maintaining loyalty became essential tools for imperial governance on a global scale. The commercial and industrial development that accelerated throughout Europe during the decades following Napoleon's death was facilitated by legal and institutional frameworks he had established during his years of power. Property rights, contract enforcement, and regulatory systems he had created provided the stability and predictability that entrepreneurs needed to invest in new technologies and expanded production. The economic infrastructure his administration had built became the foundation for industrial growth that would transform European society more completely than his military conquests had. Transportation networks established under Napoleon's direction continued to facilitate trade and communication long after the political boundaries they had connected were redrawn. Roads, canals, and bridges built according to his specifications remained vital components of European infrastructure, while the engineering standards he had promoted influenced construction projects worldwide. The transportation revolution that enabled industrial development throughout the 19th century built upon foundations his administration had laid during the brief period of continental unity under French leadership. Scientific institutions and research programs initiated during Napoleon's reign continued to advance human knowledge as the scholars and scientists he had supported carried their investigations far beyond the specific projects he had commissioned. The mathematical and technical education he had promoted produced generations of researchers who made fundamental contributions to physics, chemistry, engineering, and medicine. The scientific method he had championed through his patronage of research and his creation of technical schools became standard practice for academic institutions throughout Europe and beyond. Legal systems throughout the developing world incorporated principles and procedures derived from the Napoleonic Code as new nations sought proven frameworks for organizing their judicial institutions. The emperor's synthesis of Roman law, revolutionary principles, and practical experience provided a model that could be adapted to different cultural and political circumstances while maintaining internal consistency and logical structure. The global influence of his legal innovations exceeded even the territorial extent of his military conquests. Prison reform movements and criminal justice innovations throughout the 19th century continued to reference Napoleon's reorganization of French penal systems as evidence that humane treatment of offenders could be combined with effective law enforcement. His emphasis on rehabilitation over purely punitive measures influenced penal theory across Europe and America, while the work programs and educational opportunities he had provided for prisoners became standard components of progressive criminal justice policy. The humanitarian aspects of his domestic reforms proved more durable than the authoritarian methods he had used to implement them. Agricultural and rural development programs throughout Europe drew on techniques and policies Napoleon had pioneered for improving land use and increasing food production. The scientific approach to farming he had promoted through agricultural schools and experimental stations influenced rural development far beyond France's borders as governments recognized the economic and political importance of agricultural modernization. The increased productivity that resulted from applying his methods helped support the population growth and urbanization that characterized the Industrial Revolution. Religious and cultural tolerance policies established under Napoleonic administration provided precedents for managing religious diversity in increasingly pluralistic societies throughout Europe and the Americas. His successful reconciliation of competing religious traditions demonstrated that secular governments could maintain stability while respecting diverse spiritual beliefs and practices. The constitutional frameworks he had developed for protecting minority rights while maintaining social cohesion became models for democratic societies struggling with similar challenges. International commercial law and trade regulations evolved during the 19th century, partly in response to precedents Napoleon had established through his reorganization of European commerce and his attempts to create integrated economic systems. The customs unions and commercial treaties he had negotiated provided templates for economic cooperation that would be refined and expanded as industrialization created new opportunities for international trade. His vision of economic integration would ultimately find expression in the commercial partnerships that emerged during the later stages of European development. Medical and public health advances achieved during Napoleon's campaigns continue to influence healthcare development as military medical innovations were adapted for civilian use throughout Europe and beyond. The systematic approach to battlefield surgery and epidemic prevention his armies had pioneered established new standards for medical practice that improved healthcare outcomes far beyond military applications. The medical schools and hospitals he had founded continue to train physicians who carried his innovations to medical practice worldwide. Urban planning principles derived from Napoleon's transformation of Paris and other French cities influenced municipal development throughout the industrial world as growing populations required new approaches to city design and administration. The systematic street layouts, public sanitation systems, and transportation networks he had promoted became standard features of modern urban planning, while his emphasis on public monuments and cultural institutions established new expectations for civic architecture. Cities across Europe and the Americas adopted elements of his approach to municipal governance and development. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency that Napoleon had imposed throughout his empire continued to facilitate international commerce and scientific collaboration as the metric system he had promoted gradually gained acceptance worldwide. The precision and logical consistency of his measurement standards proved superior to traditional systems, leading to their adoption by scientific communities and commercial organizations far beyond the territories he had directly controlled. The international cooperation his standardization efforts had made possible became essential for the technological and economic development of the modern world. Veterans of Napoleon's armies who emigrated to the Americas after 1815 carried with them not only military expertise, but also political ideals and administrative experience that influenced the development of new nations throughout the Western Hemisphere. Former French officers became advisors to revolutionary movements, organizers of educational institutions, and founders of commercial enterprises that spread Napoleonic concepts of organization and governance across continents. Their practical knowledge of large-scale administration and military organization proved invaluable for societies attempting to establish stable governments and effective institutions. The cultural cosmopolitanism that had flourished during Napoleon's empire continued to influence intellectual development as the networks of scholars, artists, and writers he had brought together maintained their collaborations despite changed political circumstances. The international character of European intellectual life that emerged during the 19th century owed much to the connections his administration had fostered between creative individuals from different national traditions. The exchange of ideas and techniques that had thrived under his patronage established patterns of cultural cooperation that would persist throughout the modern era. Banking and financial innovations introduced during Napoleon's reorganization of French public finances continued to influence monetary policy and commercial practice throughout the developing industrial economy. The central banking system he had established and the commercial regulations he had implemented provided models for financial stability that other nations adapted to their own circumstances. The economic integration his empire had forced upon reluctant partners laid groundwork for the voluntary commercial cooperation that would characterize later stages of European development. So there you have it, the complete story of Napoleon Bonaparte, from a restless boy on a Mediterranean island to the emperor who reshaped the world. His journey reveals something profound about human potential and its limits, about the extraordinary heights that ambition and genius can reach, and the inevitable price that unchecked power demands. Napoleon's legacy lives on, not just in the codes and institutions that still govern our world, but in the eternal questions his life poses about leadership, justice, and the cost of greatness.